to everybody who's here. Hello, thank you for joining us. Um, I am here to promote a fellowship that HRE USA is accepting applications for currently. It's called the Edmonds Fellowship. So, in honor of Kirby Edmonds' legacy, he was the co-founder of HRE USA. So HRE USA created the Edmonds Summer Fellowship to support hands-on leadership experience in human rights education and further his work to engage young people in building human rights friendly schools and communities. So there are two projects that consist of the Edmonds Fellowship. So two fellows will be accepted. You need to be 18 years or older. You need to have the ability to commit 100 hours between June 1st and August 30th, and you will also get a $1,500 stipend. So the application cycle is now open and it will close on March 29th. I'm going to link the materials in the chat so you guys can take a look at it. And the form for the application too, I'll link that in the chat too. Thank you. Oh, and also, sorry, one more thing. There is going to be a youth conference panel on March 29th. Wait, sorry. There will be a youth conference panel on April 5th. We will be planning that and coming up, so stay tuned for that. Thank you.
Thank you, Annika.
So are we just launching in? Is that what happens now? Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Erin Canan, and I am the Vice President for Civic Engagement at Bard College. And I've been working on youth voting rights in Dutchess County, where Bard College is located, since around 1999. Yael, do you want to say hello?
Hi, folks. I'm Yael Bromberg. I get to work with Erin on occasion, and I am a voting rights attorney, litigator. I litigate in constitutional rights across the country in federal and state courts. And I teach election law and the political process at Rutgers Law School. And I get to work with Erin, and Bard is doing tremendous things, and I always get to follow them around. And also sue on their behalf when necessary. But we caused some really great trouble together, and it's really great to be joining you today. And I know we're a smaller group, so if we can have, like, at some point more participatory engagement, then we can also open up for that as well.
So speaking of that, since we are a smaller group tonight, it would be great if folks could either share in the chat or on mic and tell us a little bit about, tell us who you are and 3 things you want us to know about you as it relates to voting. So who are you? And 3 things as it, 3 things you want us to know as it relates to voting about you. So if you're willing to unmute, we'd love that. Otherwise, feel free to use the chat. I don't know if anyone's willing to jump in.
I can start us off.
Okay, go for it.
I'm Jessica Briggan, and I'm here on behalf of HRE USA. And 3 things about me in voting. I once threw my vote away in an election as an idealistic teenager, and I voted for the Green Party and Ralph Nader and ended up voting in the candidate that I wanted to vote in the least. And another thing, I'm conflicted about voting for this upcoming election, and not really sure how I feel about it. I feel like I have 2 not great options. And a third thing about me in voting is I don't know enough. I think I need to know more, to be super informed. So hence why it's great to be here.
Thank you. Cynthia or Justine, now that we're down to, Justine, Do you want to talk a little bit about what you just put in the chat?
Hi, I'm Justine. I'm currently a student at Rutgers University, and I'm studying human resource management. And I'm actually currently interested in studying employment law within that major, but I haven't taken any classes, and I don't know anything yet. But I actually don't know much about my voting rights because I think a lot of our youth don't know much, especially because like for me, I firstly just turned 20 like in January, so that was like 2 months ago, and I actually have not I don't know if it's bad, but I've not voted like at all like last year and when I turned 18 because I actually did not know like what the process was like and what I was supposed to really do because no one ever taught me. Like in school, no one taught me. They only like provided like, oh, here's a link and then do it yourself. And I'm like, oh, what do I do with this? And I don't know much about like I guess that topic itself. So I feel like I need, and also a lot of our youth have to be educated more about that, especially like Gen Z who have not like, who have just got into college or into the working space and was never really educated within that. So I'm glad you guys are able to talk about this and I would love to learn more about it because again, I don't know anything about it. And yeah, that's basically it.
Justine, what campus are you from? Where do you live?
Currently living on Bush campus in
Okay,
Richardson Apartments. Yes.
great. I was a Rutgers student also, so
Oh, what did you
great
say?
to have you here.
I got you. What campus did you reside in, or did you reside in multiple?
A few, Douglas and Cook, and then off
Oh,
campus at College Ave.
oh, okay, that's cool. Cook is so naturey. I like it, but it's so far away from everything. You know.
Hi, everyone. I was just writing it in the chat. Cynthia Gabriel Walsh, she, her pronouns. I'm with Amnesty International and I work in specifically on human rights education and our work around individuals and communities at risk. And so one of the resources we're working on is providing some educational resources for formal and informal settings that really focus on voting with informed human rights framework, like knowing how to look at some of these issues through the human rights perspective in order to make a rational decision about your voting. And we have specific platforms we're focusing around abortion and refugee and asylum seekers and freedom of expression. So it's sort of like a big responsibility. We're not specifically in voting rights, but I know that this is like a precursor to anything really is this right here. So I'm really intrigued to be here tonight.
That's great. Thank you. Annika, I don't know if you have to say goodbye or if you're actually going to have some time to unmute and talk a little bit about.
Yeah, I was about to talk. Um, yeah, I was gonna say that I'm also from Rutgers. So my first time voting was in the 2024 president, like first time voting in a major election was the 2024, I mean not 2024, sorry, 2020 election. And um, I think I'm a political science major, so I have like participated in several like registering to vote, like those voting drives at Rutgers, but also like dress. I'm really conflicted about what's gonna happen in the 2024 election. Like I've been discussing it with students in my classes, and we're just all like, we don't know what the future holds for us, especially as young people. But I think, in my opinion, I think it's still really important to exercise your privilege, basically, that you have to vote, because not everybody can vote in this country still. So yeah, that's it.
That's great. So I'm gonna introduce myself and talk about three things for me in voting, because I became an accidental youth voter activist because I was the dean of students way back in the day in the late 90s, early 2000s. And one of my colleagues named Jonathan Becker arrived from, he had done some work in Ukraine and had been living in Hungary, and was shocked by the lack of access that Bard students had to vote locally. We actually have copies of an old survey that if students tried to vote in our county, they were asked things like, what's your parents' income? Where do you bank? What's your banking number? Where do you spend the majority of your summer? Really crazy questions. And so whenever we had any one or two students who would try to vote locally or register locally, they'd get the survey in the mail and then they wouldn't be allowed to vote. So he just thought this was something that was just, coming out of the former Soviet bloc and coming into Dutchess County and seeing like more obstruction to access to voting than maybe what he had been seeing as these countries were trying to become democratic. So I was an accidental activist. Since that time, the shenanigans that I've witnessed has hardened my heart. And unfortunately, we've had 4 lawsuits in our county where we've had to put pressure on the local board of elections. And we actually have the same commissioner who continues to identify ways. So one of the things that I've realized and why I continue to be engaged in this issue is that I realized how important it is to be strategic. And so I'm going to talk about planning after Yael sort of gives us the baseline about the topic more generally, but that it's a moving target. And so right when you're finished with one kind of approach, the other side identifies a new way to recalibrate and try to once again limit access. And so, Cynthia, to your point about wanting to think about this from issues-based is really important because it will motivate people to really understand why and what they're doing at the polls. But to Justine's point is that, it almost feels deliberate when you're involved in this work for a long time that youth voters are not provided the education and the tools to understand what they should do. And certainly when they go away to go to college, there is a disincentive by those communities to help students really understand what their rights are in voting. And so we're going to use that sort of youth voting as a case study for what's happening in other forms of voter suppression. So anything we're talking about could sort of be translated to other kinds of groups where the limit to the access to the polls is a deliberate structural decision made by people in power, and so that they could maintain power. And I say that having seen and witnessed a lot of this over the last 20 years. I'm actually a poll worker because of one of those challenges. And so I actually work the polls for our college so that when the students come, they see a friendly face. And we do a lot of voter education. So I'll talk a little bit more about that, but I'll turn the floor over to Yael, who's going to kind of give us the legal structures and challenges to youth voting.
Hi, folks, and welcome, Christy. If you can drop in the chat where you're from and what brings you here, we'd love to include you. I'll do a quick screen share. The truth is that I have a lot that I can offer, and now that I have heard from you all, kind of where you're oriented. Can you see? Do you see my PowerPoint here?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Right. Let me just expand you guys on my screen. Okay, great. So briefly about myself, as I told you, I'm a practitioner. I have a solo law practice and I work in partnership with folks across the country, including young people. And it really warms my heart that there's Rutgers people here. I was a student organizer when I was at Rutgers fighting for the right to vote. So I love that you're here. And I also want to encourage you that there's so many there's so much good stuff that you can do at your age. And I think that sometimes it just feels like the problems are too big and they're too amorphous, and but you really can start where you are and you can do so much good work. And I'd love to kind of continue a little bit about what you could do specifically at Rutgers, but we'll keep it a little more broad for our purposes. So as I said, I teach at Rutgers Law, and I'm a legal scholar of the 26th Amendment, which is the most recent voting rights related amendment that lowered the voting age to 18 and outlaws age discrimination with regard to access to the ballot. And I wanted us to start a little bit actually with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, because we're here from trying to have a human rights framework. And the declaration was drafted by a UN committee chaired by Eleanor Roosevelt and adopted in December 1948. And it consists of 30 articles that detail the basic rights and fundamental freedoms. And I'll drop a link to what those are as well, because they're actually really interesting to read. And Articles 18 to 21 focus on liberties. And you should have a link that's uploading slowly. Let me know if that works on your end, because I know it came in a little funky. Okay, I'll drop it when I'm done. So Articles 18 to 21 talk about the constitutional liberties and political freedoms specifically, including the right to vote. And I want to offer kind of a perspective on 21, and then we'll kind of look at what that compares to with the United States Constitution. So Article 21 of the Declaration provides that everyone has a right to partake in the government of his country directly or through elected representatives. Everyone has the right to equal access to public service in the country. And this is something that we also have in the US Constitution, that the will of the people shall be the basis for the authority of government, something that is easily forgotten and often overlooked. This shall be expressed in periodic and genuine elections, which shall be universal, and equal suffrage shall be held by secret vote or by the equivalent of free voting procedures. So let's compare that a bit with evolution of the federal right to vote in the United States Constitution. So we had obviously this nation's original sin of slavery, and evolution of the right to vote can also be tracked by efforts to suppress the vote because you have this tension of suppression, political violence, and physical violence, and then a rebirth of new constitutional amendments and rights. Starting with the nation's first Reconstruction following the invalidation of slavery, that's the 13th Amendment, and it came in as a bundle of rights with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, invalidating the condition of slavery, establishing the right to due process and to equal protection under the law. That sounds really similar to some of the language we just saw with Article 21. And the right to vote free of discrimination, essentially, free of race, color, or condition of race, color, or servitude. We also saw that a little bit reflected in the 1948 Article 221 of the amendment with regard to equal access to the suffrage. Then that was the nation's first Reconstruction, and then it took some time. It took about 100 years for women to earn their right to the suffrage. That happened in 1920 with the 19th Amendment. It did not come in during the first Reconstruction, and there was a lot of debate around that specifically among abolitionists and feminists. And then we kind of fast forward a little bit, and this is really just a crash course. And we fast forward a little bit as Jim Crow laws are established throughout the South, like establishing poll taxes, you have to pay to vote, literacy tests, you have to prove your ability to vote, you have to be able to figure out the number of jelly beans in a jar, and all of these hoops that are basically put in place. Like Erin said, there's always going to be a new hoop, and that applied then, and that it also applies now. And so all of these culmination of Jim Crow laws ushered through and other forms of race-based discrimination created this popular resistance called the Second Reconstruction, where the civil rights movement came together, and you had, the women's rights movement, the Chicano rights movements, the Black rights movement, all these groups coming together saying this is not working for us. And like the first Reconstruction, this was met by physical violence and political violence, and eventually there was this boiling point and a culmination of a new bundle of rights that were ratified. And to the degree that certain rights were not newly ratified, there was a manifestation of rights that were previously ratified but didn't really come into reality. So, for example, the 24th Amendment was ratified, invalidating poll taxes, and then all of these federal laws were passed, like the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the Fair Housing Act, etc. But a lot of these are trying to do what the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments tried to do 100 years ago. And it took 100 years to really manifest those rights and gain renewed appreciation for them. And along with this, at the end of the Second Reconstruction, we also saw ratification of the most recent Voting Rights Amendment to be ratified in our Constitution, which is the 26th Amendment, lowering the voting age to 18 and outlawing age discrimination with regard to ballot access. This is the language of the amendment. It says, the rights of citizens of the United States who are 18 years of age or older to vote shall not be denied or abridged, that's important, or abridged, by the United States or by any state on account of age. So age-based voter discrimination is unconstitutional. And that Congress has the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation, meaning Congress can pass a statute, just like the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed to uphold the rights of the 14th and 15th Amendments. Congress can pass legislation to uphold the rights of the 26th Amendment. And I'm actually the architect of legislation that is introduced in Congress by Senator Warren and Congresswoman Nikema Williams, specifically to do that. And it's a multi-pronged approach, which is also informed by the local work that we were doing in Bard for on-campus polling locations. And in many respects, what we're experiencing right now can also be considered a potential third Reconstruction, as we're seeing all forms of political and physical violence and an expectation that we evolve eventually as a country, right? We saw the siege of the US Capitol on January 6th, obviously political violence and also physical violence. We see, the former president threatening good faith election workers in Georgia, and we're continuing to see that play out even on the news sets today with regard to related litigation around that. And this is a question about, I'm not going to go through this entire slide, but what it kind of sets out is that we're continuing to grapple with this story, right? On the federal level, on the state level, and on the local level. Local initiatives look like putting polling locations on campuses, recruiting poll workers. Annika, do you have a question? Oh, she's saying goodbye. Et cetera. In some cases, the boards of elections are elected, and those are really important positions also to make sure that we have, even when they are partisan, meaning the Democratic Party and the Republican Party support them, that they're functioning in a nonpartisan way for the fair administration of our electoral systems. And I'll just give you very briefly some examples of state initiatives like election day registration or online voter registration. There are ways in which we can modernize our elections on the state level if we feel like the federal level is intransigent. and also on the local level. We can do such amazing work, for example, by bringing polling locations on campuses. So one of the things that's really interesting to me about the 26th Amendment and why I like talking about it is that it is the quickest amendment in the United States history to be ratified. It passed the states in less than 100 days, and it did that with huge cross-partisan and bipartisan support, which means that at least technically, this should be a non-polarizing amendment. I think that Republican parents also don't want to see their kids have their votes disenfranchised. And so to me, this is a way to enter the conversation around voting rights in a way that is unifying. Age, unlike other constitutionally protected classes like gender or race or national origin, et cetera, is actually something that we all experience, we all age out of. And so from that perspective, it's actually a universal trait. And I think that there's something really interesting about that. And young people have always written the story of America. We look at these pictures like these tinged black and white photos, but these are our nation's constitutional architects. And we forget that they were actually quite young when they were doing the work of writing and manifesting the rights of our constitutional amendments in our republic. Alexander Hamilton, he was in his early 20s. Obviously, one of the nation's founders, Frederick Douglass, was 23 when he first took the stage at the Massachusetts, Cynthia, you're from Massachusetts, Anti-Slavery Society meeting. And Alice Paul, she was in her early 20s. She actually went internationally. So from an internationalist perspective, is interesting too, that Alice Paul went internationally to England to study the women's suffrage movement there, and was so inspired that she came home and joined the American suffragist movement and actually became a leader of it. And I think I'm going to try to wrap this up a little bit, but the Senate report that supported the ratification of the 26th Amendment contemplates special burdens, that forcing young voters to undertake special burdens, such as obtaining absentee ballots or traveling to one centralized location in each city, for example, in order to vote, might serve to dissuade them from participating in the elections, that this is inconsistent with the purpose of the Voting Rights Act, and might even amount to a denial of their 14th Amendment equal protection rights. So what does this mean? When a election is scheduled when students are not in session and students can only vote by absentee, that this may be a violation of the 26th Amendment. This probably sounds familiar to you because this is a very common phenomenon that students experience around the primaries, which are so critical in any state, including in states that might be traditionally considered red or blue. We like to really focus on the states that have like the general election conflicts, but this is something that's very specific to kind of affairs within each state that is more solidly red or blue, or traveling to one centralized location in each city. This is contemplating off-campus polling locations as a violation of the 26th Amendment in the legislative history. And these are just some examples. And the other thing that I find really interesting here is that most amendments are not set up as expansive amendments. They're anti-discrimination amendments. You cannot discriminate against me because of my race or my gender or my sex, right? You cannot discriminate against me because of age in the context of the 26th Amendment. But here, there's actually very affirmative language. They're saying, in order to exercise their right to vote, well, it might well serve to dissuade them from participating. This is expansive language, encouraging voter expansion and participation, not just anti-discrimination. So really quickly, some special burdens. Voter registration obstacles for young people. For example, having to prove your residency if you live on campus by providing a supplemental form of proof of residency that other voters do not have to offer, or for example, that a college might not give you. You have to prove you live on campus when you get to the polling location, right? But how do you provide that proof? And what's the degree of discretion that the poll worker is going to assign to you? This can be a very intimidating thing for a first-time voter. Strict voter identification laws in the country, including those that do not includes student voter identification, student IDs as a valid voter ID. A lot of people are really surprised that 7 states do not allow young people to vote without an excuse. That specifically, if you're age 60, if you're age 60 or 65 plus, you don't have to offer an excuse to be able to vote by mail. But if you're below those ages, you do. This is what's called prima facie voter discrimination on account of age. There's an age-based delineation, and there's one system for younger voters and another system for older voters. That as of yet has not gone up to the United States Supreme Court, although there have been some ongoing cases, and it's eventually going to have to make its way up there. Campus gerrymanders, extraordinarily understudied, but a phenomenon. The fight to bring polling places on campuses, like at Bard or at Florida, where we litigated, because the Secretary of State said you just can't put polling locations on campuses during the early voting period. And we sued and got that overturned based on the 26th Amendment grounds. And then we quantified the impact. The impact is enormous. I don't have the numbers here, but you can just see that when you expand the ballot and you look at the electoral margins and the specific races, that this actually, it's a reform that people don't traditionally think of, but it actually can have very expansive effects. And there's just so much more. And I really like to be in the space where we're not just litigating. I like to be in the space where we're teaching and we're using the law as a lens to inform advocacy and organizing. And litigation is really just a last resort. And what I really like about the 26th Amendment is that its future is unwritten, that we can be active writers of it and participants in creating that, so that one day people are looking back at all this great work that we've established and we've written these rights into this Constitution, because that's really what the Constitution is about. We've been seeing record high youth turnout year after year. I'm going to skip over these numbers. But the last thing that I think I'll leave us with is that this is also, the youth population is really interesting because it's also going to be an emerging non-white share of voters. It is an emerging base of voters and also a emerging non-white share of voters. So millennials and Gen Z will dominate the future electorate. By this year, younger cohorts outnumber the boomers around among voters. And by 2036, in just 12 years, they'll constitute 60% of the electorate. So this is an invitation to engage younger voters rather than ostracize them or, not fully embrace or add to voter confusion or other ways in which all of these like little systems of the election administration process ends up impacting them, whether or not we realize it or not, and whether or not we realize that that this is actually discrimination based on class. When I was developing my first law article, which went kind of viral as far as law articles can go, I was workshopping it with constitutional rights teachers and practitioners. And these are like a little bit older folks. They have kids that are college age, and these folks that are practicing rights-based attorneys didn't think about how when their child told them, oh, I thought I registered to vote, but I showed up at the polls and it wasn't there, or I went to the polling location, they sent me to the wrong polling location, and then I had to go here and I was in between my classes, and I thought I filled out a vote by mail application, but then it came to my campus PO box and it got rerouted and I don't know where it is now, and all these different ways in which the process is harder for them. These folks didn't perceive that as being a class-based discrimination. And the 26th Amendment actually provides us with a really helpful lens to understand young voters specifically as a protected class. And we're about 52 years since ratification of the amendment. And it's largely forgotten what this amendment even is. And so this is an invitation to kind of join the fold and to teach and to raise awareness around it. There's my crash course.
Thank you, Yael. And something that I want to also just highlight is that we often hear in the media how disengaged youth are. So we hear that it's like blaming the people who are struggling in the way like Justine described her own experience of like, I don't really understand what it is I'm supposed to do. We don't take that civic identity, that civic identity development. We don't take that seriously. And we often dismiss it as the individual voter's problem, or youth don't care, or they're disengaged. And it's exactly the opposite. I find that youth voters are very much paying attention. They are very much engaged in the issues, sort of what Cynthia's thinking about. How do I frame these things around issue-based voting? And that is often, I think, where we find youth voters, but the whole process is so confusing that and because youth move the most, you've got people who are moving to and from, you don't live in the same place often throughout your entire 4 years of college. If you're going straight into the workforce, you're often also moving or needing to move from one town to another. If you move to a big city, it can be very confusing. There are different requirements in different states. And given that everything that we do to register anything now, all we need to do is something digitally, that it's one of the last things that you actually have to do by paper, and you actually have to mail in a ballot, mail in a voter registration form. It can be very confusing. And why is it that I have to do that? So it hasn't caught up with the way that we're doing everything else. And so I think, to the way you explained it, Justine, is exactly, I think, what most of the students we end up working with. So I'm going to just share with you a document that we developed a plan at BARD over the course of many years based on all these different challenges, because what we realized we needed to do is some community education. And so as you're starting to think about, how can what we are doing at BARD or in the youth voter space translate to other forms of voter engagement, we realized one of the first things that we needed to do was to develop a plan. And we actually got help to do this by two organizations. One, the Andrew Goodman Foundation, that actually helps support young ambassadors on campus to do peer-to-peer voter registration. And the other is this organization called All In, which is based in, I'll change the setting changes, sorry. I hate that. I always think I've got it, and then I don't. So that should work now. Try it again, maybe refresh. So what we realized is that you have to have a strategy, because you really need to engage voters individually. That really doesn't replace anything from a peer-to-peer or voter-to-voter conversation. Nothing replaces that. And that's really important. So it's actually a lot of work to think about this, and people power. So we needed to engage first the students to actually understand that youth voting is that their access to the polls are actually restricted. As Yael said, not even young people understand some of these systems as being, suppressing their vote in some way. They just think somehow, maybe I'm not getting it. I don't understand, so they sort of blame themselves. So getting people to understand where those access points are. And one of the very first things we did way back a million years ago is we started to require a stop at orientation for all students, regardless of their status at the campus, to come in and check in with someone to check off either that they are already registered somewhere else, they want to register locally, or they're not eligible to register, because you can always engage in the elections regardless of your capacity to vote. We have a lot of our international students are engaged in the work of getting the vote out, because they're, often very interested in what happens in the American elections. This often the American elections impacts what's going on to happen internationally. And so our international students in some cases have been almost more engaged in the process of the election in some cases than other students. So I think it's important to first engage the community. So as you're thinking about this and translating this for your own experiences, beginning to speak about the issue as an issue, and starting to think about how do we engage all of the various voters that we're trying to engage, including youth, because each one may have sort of specific parameters that you're needing to incorporate into a plan. And that's what we realized, is that we needed to engage across campus. So we actually needed to name a leadership team. We needed to develop and incorporate a multi-constituent team. And we needed to do a couple of things in that process that were about access and monitoring. And these are, I think, the most important things that you can think about if you're developing a plan. First is, what are the access points for voter registration? And how can I engage them early on? And how can I engage them beyond the election? A lot of times youth feel like people are, and I think a lot of communities feel this way, that people parachute in when they want them to register and they want them to go to the polls, and they're doing everything they can to make sure that they're getting to the polls. And then they never hear from them again. And I think that that young people especially are very savvy to this. They have a lot of access to information. And so to really think through, and I know people are challenged this particular election, I think Annika mentioned this, that people are really, struggling with this idea of, maybe I don't actually want to engage in this process. And, we can talk a little bit about that, and why we actually think people should engage in this process. But that really one of the first things to do is to say, regardless of that decision, what you decide to do on election day, is something that you can really think through. But if you don't register to vote, the decision is made before you. And it's really important to first get on the voter registration path early enough so that you can actually check your status and make sure that you understand that your voter registration form went through. A lot of people make assumptions that this happened. What we actually do with our voter registration forms is we have all of our students come through, we collect them, we make copies of the voter registration forms, and then we actually track when it becomes publicly available. You can check your status online about your voter registration status, when those students are actually then converted into voters online, so that we can check to make sure that they actually have successfully registered to vote. And we will get back in touch with students who we see whose voter registration forms aren't getting processed quickly enough. And we will get in touch with them and say, maybe you should re-register, maybe you should submit another voter registration form in time. And oftentimes when we hear that what we hear from students is that they think that they can just register up until the day of the election. And that actually is a very rare, that's very rare. I think New Hampshire might be the only place to do it. And in fact, if to do that, I think you actually have to go to a county seat. I don't think you can just go to a polling site and register on site, which a lot of people believe they can do. So monitoring and tracking the process from start to finish, and starting the process early enough so that any voters that you're looking to engage with, you understand what their voter status is, and that you're helping them understand when and if they need to redo the process again. And then to find out what is their monitoring what happens at the poll itself. So what was the experience of the voter? Almost like we would, we're constantly giving stars, 5 stars for, restaurants and things like that, but we do very little to understand what is the experience of the voter when they go to the polls. I could show you a very frightening video that was what we had to make in, I think it was 2010, when we had a poll watcher come to the polling site where the majority of the voters were students. And he literally stood in people's personal spaces and challenged every 5 voters based on address. So we had about 30 students who were not able to vote on the paper ballot, where they actually had to fill out an affidavit ballot. And we went to court, and this is one of the times we were to sue Dutchess County. We went to court to make sure that those votes were counted. If we hadn't been monitoring what the experience was, I was a poll watcher that day. We actually videotaped it. We took down witness testimonies. We took down all of the names of the voters who were not eligible to vote on the machine. And then we followed up with the lawsuit, and we covered the cost of the lawsuit. because we felt that it was really important to demonstrate to students, if we think that it's important for them to make this access point, to go to all the trouble of voting, that we want to make sure that that experience is a good one, and to understand what the rights are. If students are turned away, or anyone is turned away, we know this experience at the polls, that if they're turned away because maybe their name was misspelled, and in fact they were registered, but they simply got this happens a lot of times if people have like first and last names that are like first names, like Chris John or something like that. Oftentimes their names will get swapped and it'll be under John Chris. So looking up birthdays, a lot of poll workers will not go to the extra trouble to do this unless they're really motivated. So that's why I started to become a poll worker. So thinking about what's the experience at the poll and what are some of the things that you can troubleshoot in advance so that the experience of that voter is a good one. Because if you get turned away, if you're challenged in the way that those voters were challenged back in the day, and then they're turned away, what's the likelihood that they're going to return back to the poll the next year? It may be many, many, many years until they return to the poll. So again, as we're looking at youth engagement and we're sort of blaming them for not engaging with the system, but in fact, the system is meant to dissuade them from participation. And then they try to participate and then they have a bad experience and they're like, I'm not going to do that again. Then why? And then we continue to say they're disenfranchised, and then they hear that rhetoric and then they're like, well, I should just give up because apparently my generation is just disenfranchised. It feeds into the narrative, and then the outcome is then one that is the one that we claim is happening, when in fact it's the system that's making that occur. So when we developed this, we realized that we needed to make sure the access points were wide open. We needed to monitor the process along the way, monitor the experience, and then engage with the voters based on what their experience was. And then we needed to talk about the issues past the election. What just happened in the election? What just happened in terms of who got voted in, especially around the local elections? This is true. Dutchess County, we just had a contentious election around the county executive. That's a $500 million budget that works at mental health, youth services. My dog just walked into the room, and now my whole family is, hold on just a second. Sorry. So all of the things we care about: criminal justice, mental health, recycling, green spaces, parks, recreation. Those are all things that are determined in New York State on the county level. Very few people come out to vote for that position. But in fact, that's where you can make such a huge difference. So the narrative around the federal, I think, is also really disenfranchising, because it feels like millions of voters are voting there. I'm in a state where it's not going to make a difference. Whereas on a local election, you could actually swing an election with one vote. And oftentimes those local elections come down. And if you bring 10 friends, then you can swing the election by 10. And then you become a voting bloc that people care about. Because you're demonstrating that you can actually make a difference in an election, and that you're motivated enough to come out and to speak your mind through your vote. And that's where you can actually get people to pay attention to you. But that's something we don't really talk about, because we don't do anything around helping youth understand just how powerful those local elections are. And what it actually means to be engaged with their local officials. So as you're thinking about the processes of determining how to do this work, taking into account everything that Yael talked about around why it's important and what's going on sort of on the larger stage, you then translating that for people in your communities and developing a plan that works through not just access to the polls, monitoring that experience, but then building beyond in terms of that engagement around the issues, and talking about those issues, and who just got elected, how is what they're doing, influencing the issues that you went to the polls to vote for. So are you communicating with the people that you've registered about what's happened? Are there upcoming important meetings that they might care about? Are there upcoming pieces of legislation that they might want to track? And how can you do that? And so that's another thing that we're working on, engaging with a year-round conversation with students, so that when they are done, when they've graduated from college, we know that the earlier people vote, the more likely they are to be lifelong voters. They've practiced this a number of times within an environment that's set up for them to understand how the system works, so that when they move, they know what they need to do and how they can engage beyond that. So I'd like to stop there for a second, because I think one of the things we wanted to do was to have you think through maybe some strategies or action items that you could take away from today and from some of the things that you've heard about today. So I'd like us to take just, maybe 2 minutes to write down some ideas about ways that you might think about a next step, knowing that we have this big election coming up. And there are down ballot positions as well that we want to think about. So thinking about what's going to be on the ballot, who are the people that are going to be on the ballot, what are the issues that are going to be on the ballot, and really thinking through some action items in terms of engagement. And maybe we could think specifically about youth, but if you have another constituency that you're trying to work with that may have also been disenfranchised and you're trying to think about how to engage them, maybe write down a couple of sort of action items or next steps or questions or challenges that you may have, and then maybe we can have a conversation about that. So if you could just take, a minute to jot down some of your thoughts, and then we'll have a conversation.
Erin, do you want people to put it in the chat or just?
People can put in the chat, but maybe write first, and then it would be good maybe if we could have a little bit of a conversation. So,
Okay.
Maybe share in the chat and then also unmute.
Okay, and just to recap, people are sharing, I can put it in the chat so people know they're sharing exactly.
So you're going to be talking about some action items or takeaways that you want to have. So assuming that you're engaging with some kind of constituency or having conversations around the elections, what are some action items that you might be developing, thinking about in terms of the upcoming election? It could be specific to voter registration. It could be ways that you might want to engage with the particular constituency, or challenges that you're having in your own community around this. And some takeaways that we might want to think about for you in your planning, because presumably you showed up here today to think about this in relationship to the upcoming election, I'm assuming. Okay. So I put two things. One was sort of a logistical thing that we're sort of thinking about, that we were sort of newly challenged with this past election. And that's related to students, transgender students who no longer use a legal name. And at the college, they're able to make the changes that they want to make on their student IDs. And but then when they come to the polling site, they're often confused about what to do, because it's, again, one of the first times they're interfacing with a sort of a legal process. There was a lot of confusion there. So we're actually thinking about a constituency that is more prevalent on our campus now, and we want to make sure that we're meeting their needs. So really being aware of who's in your community and understanding what particular challenges might be, and then how can you work to address those challenges. So that's one thing. And then more generally, sort of thinking about how to engage students who are really feeling, I think, overwhelmed by this lack of real choice. I think that's what a lot of students are struggling with. Like, how do I go to the polls if I don't feel like I can connect to either one of the candidates? And I think just telling them, of course, you have to care isn't enough. You have to actually really engage them. And that's some of the work around the issues and that peer-to-peer conversations. But that is another thing, sort of being on a college campus, generally thinking about those things, I would say. So those are the two challenges that we're working on.
Can I say something? I think like another type of challenge that people might be facing are people who have, like, if there are disability access issues for people with disabilities, because I know some people who might want to vote, like adults, like people in my family or like any family friends that have disabilities, that are not able to have those are not able to go to those polls because of physical barriers, and having like things like inaccessible entrances, and maybe lack of voting equipment, or for individuals with like visual or mobile impairments, and also like not having that. So, sorry, there's lots of background because I live in a college campus, and lots of people are, yeah, and things like insufficient accommodations for, yeah, voters with disabilities overall. I think also another issue is what you've also talked about, which was access points for the youth, and how it's good that lots of youth have online access, like lots of access online for registration and voting information, but there are also a lot that are not informed on, especially on college campuses, because I know I'm not that informed whenever I'm on campus. And that's why I'm glad you talked about an action plan. Also, if I glitch, my computer is kind of like broken because I haul it through while I go to classes, so I might have dropped it. So, but I'm also, so that's why I'm glad you talked about that action plan and sent that Google Doc in the chat. To actively engage college students and also guide them through the process, which is, I think, is really good objective-wise, because I remember you also talked about how millennials and Gen Z are going to be like one of the major mass population in the future to that makes up the majority of votes in the future. So I think it's really, I think, inspirational to see and hear the amount of effort and dedicated time that everyone puts in to count votes, because you also talked about stories of how like some votes don't count if they change their name or they got the address wrong, and how you use your own funds to be able to get it into court. And I think that's actually like really good to hear, because I don't hear a lot of those stories, and I know lots of my peers don't know much about those too. So I'm glad to hear it.
Carrie? And then Rosemary, after we'll call on you next. Carrie had her hand up.
Thanks, Justine. It's great to hear the student perspective about what you're also experiencing. on campus. So I was just going to share a couple ideas of what we've been talking about. So I'm at the University of Minnesota, so we're a very large campus, but I used to be at Albion College, which is a very small liberal arts campus. So when at Albion, we had done a voting rights toolkit that one of my student researchers had put together that really, and I put a link in the chat, but that detailed what to do if you're an in-state student, out-of-state student, that really went through the details of Michigan law at the time, although it has changed since then. But so that was really helpful, and I'm looking to do that here. So at the University of Minnesota, I direct a human rights program, and one of the things that we're doing is this summer going to hire an undergraduate student worker to help work to devise a rights-based, a human rights perspective inspired toolkit around voting in the state of Minnesota for in-state and out-of-state students, but also to coordinate with other entities on campus that traditionally do some voter engagement and voter registration, as well as the League of Women Voters. And so our local League of Women Voters is interested in collaborating with the campus on a couple events. And so that's another thing that we're doing, is trying to facilitate, because a lot of times individual programs or units might do something. And so your plan is amazing, right? To have a coordinated effort across campus. We're probably not quite in the position to do that yet, but we're trying to investigate what else is being done across the campus so that we can leverage and collaborate together along with League of Women Voters. So thank you for sharing those things. And actually another link that I will share with all of you is Human Rights Watch also does a voting, it's not quite voting rights, but it's like human rights in elections, like, which is information on human rights issues, and a human rights analysis about what issues matter when you go to vote, which is actually kind of interesting too, that I'll share in the chat. So I'm curious to hear what other people are doing.
Thank you so much, Carrie. That's great. I just put a couple of other resources in the chat. Rosemary.
Well, I'm not doing what I used to be doing, but because I'm even retiring from my retirement. But one of the things that I have done and that I think are important at the university level, and I even like to see this at the high school level, is to develop service learning projects, not just to persuade individual students to go out and vote when they are of voting age, but to take a cohort of young people who have more transcultural skills than their elders and because a lot of what I find, I live in New Mexico, and we have elderly whose first language is not English. We even have some elderly whose first language is neither English nor Spanish. It is an indigenous language, although they have some familiarity with English and the other languages around them. And they often don't go to the polls because they just feel overwhelmed by the whole situation. But just as I have advocated for intergenerational going to the doctor, so that somebody who is part of the patient group understands what's being said and can translate it back. I mean, the best team I ever saw was a very elderly Navajo man who'd been a code talker, and his son, who was in his 60s and was bilingual to dad and the doctors, but not culturally comfortable with them. And his son's son, the old man's grandson, who was very acculturated and could talk doctor talk at doctors and workers' comp talk at them. And they went as a team. They didn't deal with doctors and dad's orthopedic needs any way other than as a team. And not only does that mean that Grandpa was getting what he needed, but the youngest of the three was learning the skill of facilitating working with the system. And I like to see that, especially in multilingual and multicultural communities. I think there's a very important role for the young, most acculturated members of these language minorities and cultural minority communities to learn to negotiate the system for their neighbors, for their family. And one way to give them time to do it is to have service learning credits. I have sponsored some at the university level, where I had students who worked under me on various human rights projects. But it seems to me that, and it also means that a group of students come together to deal with the system. I'm having this problem getting this person registered. Oh, well, I found you can do it this way. Students talking to students. I had that work very effectively many, many years ago when I had a government service learning project involving indigenous students and their tribal nations. They were at University of New Mexico Gallup, but it was Zuni and Navajo that they were working with, and it does wonders.
Yes.
You know, if you can put something like that, you get a cohort. One, they are going to vote when they're voting age, or if they are already voting age, they're sure going to vote, and they're going to bring it into their community. So ways of facilitating that, I think, are really important.
Yeah, all of our work is based peer-to-peer, and we actually have a number of student led programs. We have something called Election at Bard, and that's all student led, but supported. Like we have high expectations of them, but they receive support and they get paid to do the work. That's the other thing. I think a lot of students can't do the work without getting some kind of support. And actually, some of our community partners have helped us pay for funding to support that youth leadership. And I think that's another way to acknowledge that this work is something worth their time. I mean, I think we have a lot of students who can't afford to just volunteer their time. And we know that that's something else. So either you get, it's part of a course, or it's something that you get paid to do.
If you can get work study money, that's terrific. If not, at the very least, the university should create, I mean, universities have service learning programs, and this is one area they need to expand. So that nobody does this without getting credit for it, because it's a heck of an education to do it.
It is, it is. Cynthia, you were talking a little bit at the beginning about how you're trying to engage around issues. And I'm wondering if you have some strategies that you want to share related to the work that you're doing. Or if you're just trying to figure that out.
Well, our strategy is trying to put resources into the hands of activists, of whether you're in a formal class setting, as an educator, or if you are having a conversation at the dinner table with members of your family or friends, is just to be able to have a frame of reference that is a human rights framework to speak about some of the issues that I mentioned earlier that we are focusing on, which are around refugee and migrant rights, abortion rights, and freedom of expression. So we're very much like sort of, I think, along the lines of Human Rights Watch and what we're looking to produce, and really to give people, like when you said the first thing is access. We have thought about GOTV work. It's a little bit outside of what we do as an organization. So like we have to also be careful with that. However, there's education there, even from this evening, that I've learned just in a way of framing voter registration that really comes from the human rights framework, like your right to vote, and ensuring that, you know, when you go to act upon your right to vote, that you are not met with some of these consequences that Yael had mentioned. So that's where I'm at. We're very much in development stage, working on a very tight timeline.
Do you have a goal when you want to have some of that material available?
June.
Oh,
yeah. Which is, in our opinion, like this is like we could have this should have been done 6 months ago. So, but we have a very, like, I was just looking at the Human Rights Watch, we have a very similar platform. We've already started talking about the issues, and now what we're being asked to do is really provide the resources for activists to be able to go online, access what they need to be able to go out in their communities and do the education that can accompany voter registration, that can also accompany people going into the election, into the polls, or even to, you know, prepare people for those conversations that we all have been, we all are confronted with going into any election. So it's almost like that guidebook that you wish you could take into the polls to know that if you vote for candidate A, this is what it means when it comes to refugee and migrant rights. If you vote for candidate B, this is what it means. And really having, like, we're not telling you who to vote for, but you just need to know these facts so that you're going in informed.
That's amazing. That's amazing. Thank you so much. That's a great resource. I'm gonna steal that, Carrie. Thank you for sharing. So Yael, sorry, you just
Oh yeah, I just wanted to respond to some of the comments that Rosemary made earlier. I totally agree that if in the case that you can't have paid stipends, at least finding ways for the students to get credit is invaluable, and it is a part of pedagogy and learning, and in some ways even more so. So I just wanted to reiterate that. And then the other piece with regard to this kind of multi-generational aspect, I had put up a slide earlier about the changing demographic, the changing racial demographic of youth voters, and the idea of engaging them to support the older generations is so critical, including with regard to language access. I think that you were kind of touching on this a little bit, but I saw one application of this in Chicago specifically, where young people started to volunteer to be poll workers, and they studied what was happening there. And young people were more likely to be multilingual, bilingual, multilingual, et cetera, and to be able to support other community members by offering those types of kind of translation and access services. So all the more so to be engaging them. So I just wanted to kind of like echo and lift up some of the themes that you were raising earlier.
I just want to briefly say, I remember this from a really long time ago that shows my age, that when when the Voting Rights Act of the 1960s was passed, and there was this move to get Blacks community members registered in the South and in some urban areas where they had been marginalized. The laws were not all that great, but there was such a massive outpouring of the projects by the Congress on Racial Equality and other civil rights groups to find people who were hesitant to go to the polls, to help them get registered, to help them through all the, and to go with them. So they, in a situation where there had been hostility before, they wouldn't have to go alone. And it changed voting numbers huge. I mean, the laws could be bad, and they're trying to make the laws bad now, but they can't make them so bad that there's not some path through if it's somebody's business to help you through it. And that's what I saw the civil rights organizations do. And I think we're getting to where we need to do that again.
And that's kind of how we're operating on our campus. We want to make sure that the experience from that voter registration all the way through the election and beyond and engaging the issues is something that students understand how to do and how to navigate. And that we talk a lot about coming up with a voter plan, that you go with a friend, that we have tables. We do a lot of pre-engagement, but we really set up multiple tables around the campus so that as they're getting ready to actually go to the poll, we actually had a parade to the poll this year, creating a sense of community around the poll. You can't do it at the poll, just outside the poll. That is really important, and it's best practice because I shared a resource up in the chat a little bit from an organization out of Tufts called Circle that looks at youth voting. It's a lot of research on youth voting habits. And best practices, what we really know is that students, because the access points are really limited, they get the majority of their information about almost anything from their networks of family and friends. So that's really where their circle really starts there. And so we know that some best practices for youth engagement are, Rosemary, to your point, is this sort of multi-generational, multi-stakeholder community. And so best practices really have to come from that in terms of their civic participation, and that you need to create a culture of engagement and help with the sense of belonging. That's also something to we're doing a lot around the process of going to the poll is something to be excited about. It's something to be connected with. It's something, so when we talk a lot about duty, we sort of strip away this sense of excitement or connection, or that I'm doing this with and for my community, by my community. Rosemary, what you were sort of saying is, you know, really thinking about that. And I think this is something where, especially coming out of COVID, students are really feeling that very acutely, feeling a lack of connection to communities, very difficult. A lot of their communities that they're connected with are online. And again, this is an in-person experience. So how do we translate some of that to connecting with the polls and then connecting with the issues beyond? And so really looking at some of these best practices that we know are tried and true, and that peer-to-peer conversation really can't be underestimated. And then we have all of these stakeholder groups that we try to, so speaking of community, and Carrie's point about the League of Women Voters, we have to think about the multiple ways in which we are an ecosystem of a community, and that students can have these various access points around voting, and our communities can have these access points around community, just sort of generally, from indicators from institutional leaders. So our president for our college sends out a note to first-year students and to upper college students, encouraging them not just to vote, but to become a poll worker, and encouraging the faculty to, we're not going as far as taking the day off, just because we have a polling site on campus and the line is about 15 minutes long. So, and we're open 6 a.m. to 9 p.m. and we have access to early voting. So nobody's quite there yet. But lots of multiple ways to emphasize to the community that it's a value of our community. And then encouraging students having access points off campus to opportunities. So seeing the election or seeing the engagement as identifying specific opportunities for students to have, to the point of either through service learning or jobs or volunteering, gaining that experience with a campaign. So we do a lot to bring the campaigns to campus, regardless of party, so that students can actually get positions with those campaigns if they want, really pushing for the local community organizations to be connecting with students. And then really asking faculty to take a day to talk about civics in one shape or another, regardless of what their discipline is. So if it's an art, if it's, everybody has some way in which they can integrate or talk about civics. And so that's another thing that we want to really emphasize, is that there's these different ways in which the community can come together and express the value of participation, and that can translate to any of our students, regardless of their eligibility to vote, as I said earlier. So these are some best practices that we really promote, some ways that we try to engage the community. And I see that you are reflecting all of these. It's really reaffirming to hear from you in your different vantage points that these are also ways that you're trying to engage different constituencies. And what we would say is, if you could think about how this applies specifically to youth, because they might have multiple identity factors that are working against their access points, and that we know in addition that just the onboarding to what the system looks like is in itself a sort of structural issue that disenfranchises them, and that in some ways that's sometimes actively working to disenfranchise them. So thinking about those multiple identity points and thinking about what role your organization, we as a college are thinking about our responsibility to youth voters. How can you integrate or think about some of this and integrate this into the way that you're going to be framing your election-based work in the coming months? Yael, is there anything else that you want to add? Anything else that you want to?
No, I think that's everything. I just want to flag, I dropped a link, Erin. It took me some while to find this, the OSIN resource, but there's some really nice, some folks asked for the slides. There's actually really short clips of Erin talking about how to create a student voting plan and what that process looks like step by step there. They're done as, I think they're like 5-minute intervals. They're created to keep people's attention, but be really focused on the subject area. There's some short clips that I did that are kind of short form of what I did earlier today with the slides. So it's actually even a better resource than just the slides themselves. So poke around there. There's some really great fun things there. Like we got a grant from the Mellon Foundation to create a new course that teaches students across different institutions at the same time, that they all join in via Zoom. So then we're teaching students from like different HBCUs in addition to BARD. At the same time, we're learning the evolution of student voting rights, and we're talking about all these different aspects of the 26th Amendment and other voting rights issues. So the links that are the short videos that are offered at the OSIN thing also feature some of our partners at the HBCUs talking about the HBCU's roles on in the second Reconstruction and expanding the right to vote. And so you get different perspectives there. It's actually a really great, I totally forgot about it. So thank you to whoever asked about the presentation, because this is much better than that.
The last thing that I would add is taking a look at what proposed legislation there may be in your state around poll access to how to vote. There are a lot of, laws that are being created to disenfranchise. Texas is looking to pass, and I don't know if they did, Yale, actually removing polling sites from college campuses. And what I just posted in the chat is we just did a study, New York State, we were part of a process to push for legislation to have polling sites on college campuses where there were 300 local voters, and that they would be in accessible sites on the campus. And since that law came into being in 2022, only one additional campus has added a polling site, and that was Vassar, and we helped support them. The League of Women Voters was essential in that, and BARD to sort of push. It's the same county commissioner that we've been engaged with, suing the county for various shenanigans. And I think it's important to plug into some of that bigger advocacy work as well, so that we were part of the process to get the legislation passed, and then monitoring again those sort of what are the access points, and then how are you monitoring and what's going on, because there's not a lot of colleges are sometimes feel like they're limited in what they're able to do in terms of advocacy work, because they feel like they're public schools in particular. This is very real. Private schools, it could be about feeling, I know that there were some private schools in the state where they felt that if they pushed for this, then they would get, then they would have difficulty in planning and zoning. There would be sort of political ramifications that were unseen. And so sometimes leadership around this to push for these access points, even though there is federal legislation that requires college campuses to help in the voting registration process, that actually is a requirement, but colleges take it very passively. So because they make voter registration forms available on their campus, they say that they're sort of meeting the the sort of legal standard that's required, but that in fact, we would say that that's not really meeting the spirit by which some of those laws are passed. So if there's anything else, any other questions, anything else anybody wants to add? Because you all seem to be very expert in this yourselves, and gearing up for the fight in the next couple months. Justine, I feel like we should circle back to you and get you a voter registration form, because I feel like you're activated now.
I don't know anything about, because no one has ever taught me any of this, and I feel like I was not really educated throughout my high school and college years about it, and I don't even really know where to start even. I'm not sure if like I have to do it like online, or if it's like, where is it online? And I feel like most youth get their information from social media, which may be a bad thing because you know, a few days ago, or like maybe like 2 weeks ago, like I know that like TikTok might be like banned or something, I'm not sure, that type of news. And when I heard that, I was like, oh no, I can't go on TikTok anymore. But I feel like that really kind of represses a source of media that people, especially Gen Z and millennials, use in order to get information. And there's also the problem of misinformation in news media, because, you know, I remember someone saying the more someone says something, the more it seems true. So it's very easy for people who don't know anything about their voting rights or anything about upcoming elections to be misinformed about things that are said in the media that might not be true or might not be backed up with those resources. So I feel like it's really important for especially what you talked about, and what Yael was talking about in the presentation, about having to actively have youth informed in active participation, and also like being able to back them up and support them and guide them through the process, and also to be able to give them the right and accurate information in order to like have them to be more knowledgeable and maybe be able to connect with the candidates that are represented in the elections. And so I think this was very like, I liked hearing this, because I, for one, don't know anything about my own voting rights, and I don't know anything about, not anything, of course, but like, I don't know like a good chunk of information that I should know because I was not educated. And I feel like lots of higher forms of education should be able to at least give purpose a day or maybe a week to be able to educate students and my fellow peers about the subject too. So that's just a little thought. No.
So Justine, thank you, Justine, and I appreciate your radical honesty here, because that's how we get to places. So this link that I dropped to the SIP is the Center for Youth Political Participation at Eagleton, which is a center I'm affiliated with at Rutgers. And they have a group called Are You Voting? That is young people coming together, working with the support of the administration and other student organizations to do voter registration and engagement, meeting candidates, all of that stuff. And if you click on that link and you just scroll down, they have a step-by-step guide for registering to vote in New Jersey. And they have other information here. So they're really great. I would definitely recommend trying to connect with the Are You Voting group. And I think that I'm sure they would be happy to work with you. And you're on Bush campus. I know Bush can be very isolating, but you could actually be a huge resource here. And what Erin was saying earlier about the power of tens, right? If you get to the position where you can support 10 of your friends to register to vote, and you even get them to commit to register 10 of their friends, then you're talking about influencing the elections in the hundreds, and you start to go from there, and it's like a key organizing modality. And it's also step by step. So I think the first step is, let's get you registered to vote and connected with Are You Voting? Are you ready? And then, you'll see what happens from there.
Thank you. I've never been directed to this website before and being able to have that guidance, which I think it should be the first step too, for my peers too.
Thank you, everybody. Happy to stick around if you have any questions, if there's anything that we missed, or if you have any last thoughts yourself. But we really appreciate you sticking on and engaging with us. And there's tons of things in the chat. I don't, if before you head out, if you want to grab those, so you have them. But thank you all so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you both.
Luck,
so
Cynthia, with your
Thank you so
deadline.
much. And down on the bottom, there's a 3 dots in the chat. You can click on that and it will save the chat. I have finally learned how to do that. So
Good reminder, Rosemary. Thank you.
And we will definitely have a summary that's going to be written up with Annika and Justine. So hopefully they can capture some of these wonderful links too for our e-newsletter. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
thank
Good
you.
night, everyone.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.
Thank you.